Yes, good morning. So I'm Thierry Legrand. I have been a program manager in the field of transport and packaging for many years. I'm currently the account manager for the mobility team. It's a team a bit smaller than the team of Nuno, but we are working on many standardization requests, many subjects, many directives. By essence, transport is more horizontal, touching upon energy, environment, many items. Very interesting area. So I will switch off my camera. Could you confirm that you see my screen correctly? And I will guide you through the presentation. We will start first with the Vienna Agreement. So, Vienna Agreement, what is the Vienna Agreement? It is a link between the European and the international level. So, similarly, we have a Frankfurt Agreement for CEN-CENELEC. The purpose is, of course, to harmonize as much as possible the European level with the global level and to use each other's documentation. So basically, what is the Vienna Agreement? It is a formal agreement between CEN and ISO. It exists since a while, since 1991. It has been revised at several occasions or clarified in 2016 with some guidelines for implementation. And why do we have this Vienna Agreement? It's mainly to avoid duplication of work. It is the clear work of European and international standardization. It is to harmonize as much as possible and to limit the number of divergent standards. So also, it is important to promote European interests to the global economy and to facilitate global exchange and facilitates the use of products produced by other countries within the world. So currently, there is about 32% of the ISO standard which are transposed into EN ISO. There are a small percentage of European standards which are based on ISO publication, which means that there have not been totally implemented as an ISO standard. The basis is the ISO standard, but there is slight modification which implies that we cannot have an EN ISO. So what are we doing when we work in the context of the Vienna Agreement? The first level is, of course, to have some exchange between the two organizations. This generic level, it's allows the CEN system and the ISO system to exchange information. There is a second level, then it is to start cooperation by correspondence, having exchange about type of work we would like to start, information about ideas to develop a new TCs, etc. And then more technical level, there is the first level, which is the representation in meetings. So there can be two different technical committees, but there is some interest to follow each other's work. And so there will be an agreement to participate with an ISO delegation in the CEN committee and with a CEN delegation in the ISO technical committee. But what is much more interesting are the two last levels. The adoption of available publication. So as I will mention in the next slide, there is a possibility for ISO to use some of our standards and to transform them into ISO documents. And also, which is probably the most usual path, we will transpose ISO document into EN ISO. And so the very last core level is, of course, to develop the document in parallel, which means that there will be a process with an inquiry, with a formal vote in both organizations, and there will be possibility to really comment on the development of the standard, which is not the case when you adopt an already available publication, because in this case, you take it or you do not take it, but you have no real possibility to modify it. So, as I said, there is a possibility for ISO to adopt CEN standard and for CEN to adopt ISO standard. The process is basically the same. We will have to translate, because ISO is developing the standard in French, Russian, and English. So we have no German version. We need to translate the document into German, and Dean will provide this translation. And we will, of course, get a 12 weeks inquiry in order to accept or not the document. At the end of this inquiry, there is two options, of course, is the possibility to adopt the standard as it is, or if there are too many comments, there is either a need to launch a new work item and to revise the document, the original ISO document, from scratch with parallel development, or take the element of the ISO standard and adopt it as an EN standard with some modification. So what can happen in practice? Here we have a case, I think it's standard on advanced technical ceramics, EN 15157, which was developed by CEN. And then there is a wish to take the document into the ISO collection. So what will happen is that the CEN will offer to the ISO committee the European standard, but by the fact that CEN is offering the document to ISO, the numbering will be changed. So that's why you have a new number. You will have more or less the same title, if not exactly the same title, but the number will change. So in this case, there is a typical case where European standard will be transformed into an ISO document with a new number, more or less the same text, and of course, with a new designation, because then CEN will use and transpose into the collection the ISO document and remove the previous EN, in this case, EN 15157, we remove it from the collection. This is a typical case of what we can do. So, how to implement this Vienna Agreement? So first of all, as I said already before, we need an agreement between both technical committees. Then there is a need to decide who will lead the work. Usually, ISO is leading because ISO is encompassing much more member states and countries from the world. But it may happen also that CEN take the lead. There is a need, of course, to synchronize the two production systems. So that's why we need to create a work item in CEN and also a work item in ISO. And we need to agree that we will develop those two work items in parallel within the frame of the Vienna Agreement. So this is the process which allows synchronization. This means that ISO knows that CEN has a work item which intends to transpose the ISO document, and therefore ISO CS can let's say, organize the synchronization of the inquiry and the formal vote. There is also the possibility to skip formal vote like it exists in CEN and in ISO. But as I said, we will usually have a parallel synchronized vote, which will lead to a parallel publication with an EN ISO reference, the number being provided by ISO. And so, of course, there is a possibility to amend and revise the standard, but even if the initial document was led by CEN, the initial process, with the maintenance of the standard, the default will be ISO. Of course, there is a case, exceptional case where CEN take again the lead when revising the standard, but normally 99% of the case will be led by ISO. At this stage, there is a room for some question, but I do not see many questions related to this topic. So I think I will continue and we will regroup the question later. So the next chapter is related to the harmonized standard. This is a very important subject connected to the relation we have with the European legislator and with the standardization request. So why do we have a standard supporting standardization request? Usually, it is in the context of the New Approach Directive. So what is a New Approach Directive? It is a directive which defines essential requirements about safety, interoperability, etc. It indicates what shall be achieved without specifying how. That's why it's called New Approach. In the past, there were very technical details in the field of, for example, automobile. There is still very detailed legislation developed by United Nations. And there is no real implementation of the new approach. So the standards then are, with the legislation, of course, transposed in member states. So the reference to the standard are taking place through an EC request. It's what we call a standardization request. And CEN and CENELEC developed the harmonized standard. So in summary, the ENs set out the technical specification to support the essential requirements of the directive. So it can be summarized with this pyramid, where on the top you have the Council, the European Commission, and the Parliament, which are the bodies defining the legislation. In our case, of course, we are interested by technical legislation, and most of the case, it is New Approach Directive or New Legal Framework Directive, as explained before, defining only some goals to reach, and then we will develop and meet the requirements to protect the user, to protect level of safety, to facilitate interoperability, etc. And those are remaining voluntary standards. Usually, those standards are not referred in legislation, so they are not becoming part of the law. That's why we call it harmonized standards supporting legislation. And I will explain later how this mechanism of supporting is taking place. So basically, now I start digging in a bit into the details. We have an European legislation, which is on the top left, where directive and regulation define essential requirements. This legislation usually is, or new legislation in progress, is referred into what we call the Union Work Programme for Standardization. It is a kind of menu from the European Commission of what are the new subjects that they would like to develop. And they issue such work program, they revise it every year. This allows the Commission then to issue standardization request. And then standardization request is really more a type of contract. It will become an implementation act. So it is really a formal act of the Commission approved by the European College of the Commissioner. And this will allow CEN to offer harmonized standards, as I explained before. So in order to do this, I will go into the details later, but we will develop a program, and then after approval by the program between the CEN-BT and the member states of the European Union, we will develop the harmonized standard. This is the box here, develop the harmonized standard. We can, of course, develop the harmonized standard based on the work of ISO and IEC. And we will then offer the standard to the European Commission, and the European Commission will not copy the reference into the legislation. It will list the reference into legal official journal, and we'll explain this also in a few minutes. This will allow the manufacturer to develop products which they can CE marking. This means that by fulfilling the test and the requirements of the standard, they fulfill the essential requirements of the directive. And this allows the development of the single market, a bigger efficiency within Europe, a unique standard throughout the whole Europe and more, because it encompasses also EFTA countries. And therefore, then there is a new loop. There is a need sometime to revise the legislation. You know, for example, that directives are reviewed depends from directive to directive, but regularly they are updated. And so the cycle starts again and again. So basically, the European law are directive, more and more regulation, because the Commission wish really that the member states implement it more similarly in each of the countries. They are covering a broad number of topics, which are listed on the slide. I will not read all of them. Some of them are really pure new approach directive, like machinery, pressure equipment, medical device. Others are sometimes more a kind of hybrid directive, like railways or construction. They are not fulfilling totally the principle of new approach, but it is not the purpose of this generic presentation to start with the details. Please contact the unit which is dealing with the legislation if you want more detail on a specific legislation. So the standards are then developed to support the legislation, which we call new approach. So this is, as mentioned, done through a standardization request, which is really, again, a kind of menu, a kind of also a gate, which will allow you to have the standard referred in the official journal. But it's only the first gate. There are other gates. The second gate is that they need to get a compliant assessment from a consultant. This will be developed in the next slide. But to get this compliant assessment, usually let's say the way to do this, the sensitive element is the Annex ZA. What is in Annex ZA? Annex ZA is a document which allows to match the relevant clause of a standard to the relevant essential requirement of a directive. And this is very sensitive because it will be challenged first by the consultant providing the compliant or not compliant assessment, and later possibly by the desk officer responsible of the directive. But at the end, the aim is to get the standard published in the OJEU. Only when published in the OJEU, the standard which contain an annex ZA will get presumption of conformity. So this system and this process is very, very important at the end of the day for the industry, because I explained that the industry will be able to use a standard as they are. They can declare upon which standard they are developing their product, and it facilitates usually the certification mechanism. So now we will explain a bit what is a standardization request. A standardization request, basically, there is a kind of law imposed to us. It's a kind of contract. So there is a template, and the template contains basically 6 articles. Article 1 is referred to the legislation. It is a context of the standardization request. It can be a very small standardization request which contains only a few items. It can be a very broad standardization request which contains, for example, the review of machinery program or medical equipment program. And it asks CEN-CENELEC, because this is applicable also to CENELEC, to establish a work program. But this work program is already in a way defined in the annex of the standardization request, because the Commission will give a lot of details about what are the standards intended to become harmonized standard. Of course, it can happen that there is one line and the outcome will be 2 parts, but usually the detail and the granularity of the program is very, very detailed. And this you will learn by experience, that it takes a lot of time to define the program and the content of the standardization request, because we need to be sure that we are able to cover all the topics needed and that we are not forgetting any. Because if a topic is not encompassed in the standardization request, we will not be able to ask for an assessment, and we will not be able to offer the standard for reference in the official journal. So, as you understand, agreeing on a work program is important in this context. There is an annual reporting, because the Commission wants to know how we progress with the work we have committed to carry. And it defines the concept of harmonized standard, the fact that they need to be a link with the essential requirements of the directive. And it gives also a validity. A standardization request nowadays is defined in time. Usually it is between 3 and 5 years. In the past, for those who were involved already developing standards, like, for example, I still know standardization requests a mandate on pressure equipment. This is an open mandate which has been agreed a long time ago, and we are still developing standards under this mandate. So basically, this is the content of the standardization request. Usually in an Annex 2, the Commission will define some of the requirements they wish we meet for some specific standard. They will, if it is a big program, of course, they cannot define their wish for all of the standards, but if there are new standards, they will give more scrutiny and more details about the expectation from the Commission on the standard content, and we need to be sure that we are able to do that. Another important document, which, as I mentioned, which allow the publication of the standard as an harmonized standard in the official journal, is the Annex ZA. Here I took a model of a machinery directive. It's quite broad sector. But for each of the subjects you will cover, PPE, medical, etc., you will have to find the template of the Annex ZA in the BOSS. Normally, for each directive, there is a template. There is an existence of a generic template, but many directives have fine-tuned the template, and you need to take the right template when you develop a standard for your sector. But usually the layout is always the same. There is an introduction of what is the standard and the mandate, what is the directive and the mandate, which is covered by the Annex ZA. And there are always three columns. The first column is the essential requirements of the directive. And the second column is, as I said, the typical and only the clauses which relate to the specific essential requirements. So you may imagine that if there is not enough, let's say, content in a clause of the standard to prove that you help to achieve presumption of conformity to an essential requirement, this clause will not be considered as relevant to the support of the essential requirement of the directive. And there is a big challenge which can come from the consultants and the commission. After the compliance assessment from the commission, from the consultant, and after we have submitted, offered the standard to the commission for publication in the official journal, there will be prepared by the desk officer in charge of the directives. There will be an implementing act in order to publish the reference of the standard in the official journal. And only at this stage, you will get presumption of conformity. Note that in the past, the standards were listed in the e-list of the official journal. It was just for information, but with some legal case that created some court jurisdiction, there has been more strict process imposed upon us, and nowadays the Commission is listing in the legal, so the L series of the official journal, the list of the new approved standards for reference in the official journal. So nowadays, only the new standards are listed in the legal act. But of course, to help the sector to know what is the total list of the standards applicable to a piece of legislation, the Commission is still providing an information document under the form of a list, also available in XLS format, but you can get also, for information, kind of summary of all the harmonized standards. So this is, in a nutshell, a summary of what I've said a few minutes ago. Commission is informing that they will seek to develop standardization request. A draft standardization request is proposed to CEN-CENELEC. We will discuss it within what we call a SHRAC, standardization request ad hoc group. And of course, we will invite the BT members and their representative and the TC involved to develop and to formulate comments on the draft standardization request. There will be ping-pong exchange between the Commission and CEN-CENELEC. At the end of the day, the standardization request will be approved by the Council and the BT, and then we will start developing European standards. But only when we will get positive assessment, compliant assessment from the consultant, CCMC will be able to offer it to the Commission, and this will finally be listed in the official journal of the European Commission. And by this publication, the standard can give presumption of conformity for the manufacturer to oppose CE marking if CE marking is forced. So I spoke a lot about consultant assessment. How is it handled? It is in fact handled by a kind of consultancy company which is funded by the European Commission through a Public Procurement Act. And nowadays, and since April 2018, the service provider is a company called Ernst & Young. Their contract finished end of March next year. And so the Commission is preparing new contracts for a new public procurement in order to get a new service provider. Of course, it could be still the same. This, I don't know what will happen, but the process will be through a public procurement. But what is important for you is that this body is managing a consultant, and those consultants will issue compliant or lack of compliant assessment. The consultants are not technical advisors. They are only checking that many, and that their main focus will be the Annex ZA, but also the structure of the standard. For example, if your normative references are well dated. But a consultant cannot be an expert in all the type of machine. Even if he is an expert in machine, he cannot be an expert in the type of machine that you are really producing. So he can only have a, let's say, an helicopter view of the standard and check that the way the standard is drafted help for the compliance of conformity. And this is his main task. No, I have to say, yes, you understand that the contract is nearly finished with the consultant, with Ernst & Young. For the moment, the contractor, Ernst & Young, is lacking resource, and so for the moment, the service has been a bit slowed down. This I will come later. This is already on this slide, but I will explain that Ernst & Young normally is supposed to offer a broad range of services, but for the moment, it is a little bit reduced. So yes, what kind of service can Ernst & Young offer? So it has been mentioned that by Nuno earlier that it is interesting to provide the first working draft to CCMC to see that the TC is progressing its work, but it is even more interesting when you are developing an harmonized standard, because it allows you to get already an assessment from the Ernst & Young consultant. The assessment can be carried out at working draft, at inquiry, at formal vote, and even at publication. Usually, we will have assessment at working draft, inquiry, and formal vote. But if there is still some problem with the assessment at formal vote, the Commission or CEN can try to get, or CCMC can try to get an assessment at publication. But my principle, and I think this is a principle that you should try to follow, always try to get the good document in terms of compliance with the legislation as early as possible, that when you reach formal vote, it is only very minor fine-tuning. So another recommendation, it is important that you consider at the very beginning how you structure your standard. And of course, this will allow you to see that you are not forgetting any requirements to match an essential requirements of a directive. So for the moment, it is an exceptional situation, as for the next 3 months, as there are lacking of resource, only formal vote and assessment at publication are available. But I need to speak really, because for the future, after March 2022, we expect that we will be able again to resume the full process. And of course, as I mentioned already, it is important to start as soon as possible to get the feedback from the consultant. The consultant have, for each of the process, they have 5 weeks to give their assessment. So when you transmit a document to CCMC, for example, if you are transmitting a first working document, it is important to mention, if it is an harmonized standard, that you wish that this document is submitted to EN-CEN, because the production department cannot know everything about every standard. So it is always very important to communicate properly with us. And one way of doing this, when you transmit a document, is to fill in correctly the transmission sheet. And so this will allow us to provide the document. I will explain in the next slide soon how we are transferring the document to EN-CEN. So here, you know, because it has been explained by Nuno, but you know that on top of the generic process with a flexible standard development concept, you know that you can get assessment from the HRS contractor at first working draft, during inquiry, before formal vote, and I would say this should not take often the place, but we can also do it at publication stage. So when we have a compliant assessment, this allows CCMC to offer the standard to the desk officer. Having followed this process, normally we should not meet problems because there has been a lot of filtering before, but unfortunately it happens still that the desk officer has some doubt and is refusing to publish a standard which has followed and got compliant assessment. So this quite difficult process, but you need to continue to be attentive and reply to the need. If we get a failure of the standard at European Commission level, usually it is for a minor change and we can correct it through an amendment. It is often an amendment to an annex ZA, which can be also resolved through a BT decision, but the process is quite long. So we can also, of course, get this assessment from the consultant for homegrown standard. It means standard developed by CEN without parallel vote, but it can also be carried out for standard in the parallel process, ISO process. No, as I mentioned, when we get a standard which need to get assessed by EN-CEN, we upload in the Livelink system for the moment, we upload the document in a specific HRS platform where CEN-TC secretary have also access. And so it allows us to upload in a structured way to EN-CEN the document to be assessed. And it allows also enseignants to make available to us, and it is structured by TC, made available to us the assessed standard. So it is important for you to keep, as a TC secretary, of course, to keep an eye on this platform in order to take the assessment, for example, take the assessment at the end of the inquiry, and also study the assessment along the National Committee comments. So for you to be notified when enseignant upload an assessment result, you know that there is a way to configure the notification, and you need to choose the way which is the most comfortable for you to have a notification every day or every week. This is up to you to decide with your work organization. No, this slide is important for the future, but as mentioned already, as we have lack of resource, we are not able to get assessment at early stage at inquiry, but also, and this was the first sign that enseignant was lacking resource, we do not have the possibility to exchange with the consultant, which is, of course, a very important element of the process, because if we get comments at inquiry that you do not understand, it's sometimes interesting to have an exchange in order to be able to understand what was the comments. So there is currently a platform you cannot use, but if you wish to have a face-to-face meeting for more than 4 hours, you need to fill it in. So I guess this system will resume to function when a new contract will be agreed between the Commission and the HAS service provider. Okay. In order to help you, the BT has established within a working group, has established and created under the lead of Nuno. So Nuno can give you a little bit more details if you have question on how to use a checklist. But the BT has agreed to ask for a check to fill in, for the TC to fill in a checklist. This checklist help you to see that you have really followed all the steps. It gives you some tricks to be sure that you minimize the risk of a non-compliant assessment. So this checklist need to be submitted with a transmission sheet for each time you submit a document. So at inquiry, at formal vote, you will need to submit this checklist. And for the moment, it is mandatory for CEN and also, yes, for CEN documents, but it is recommended to apply the same system for ISO-based documents. So this is where you can find on the BOSS the checklist. I will not enter too much into the details here. There is a question and answer session, but I would prefer to, as we are very close to the end of the presentation, I will just share with you the latest elements, which are more information document slides. What we summarize today, it is basically the content of the BOSS. But of course, if you have detailed questions, please go and check the BOSS, because it is really very rich in documentation, in guidance, in formatted decision, in templates. It's a mine of information to help. It also contains part 2 and part 3 of the internal rules. There is a lot of documentation that you can find before you ask a specific question to a CCMC program manager or to your unit manager within the national standardization body. There are elements like how to help you to count the voting results. There are forms and templates. So I invite you to surf and find your way through this very interesting tool. As I said, there are already formatted decision for most of the delegated decision, for all the delegated decision, and so you can already use the format of those decisions to help you to develop more specific decision. And also useful information will go very fast. After each BT, we issue a newsletter which gives you a summary of all the BT decisions. So you can find this on the web page. So you will get the link. I suppose the PPT will also be circulated. And you have a lot of interesting links that you can use again. Note that we have recently restructured the CEN-CENELEC website. So we have also organized and regrouped the information relevant for experts in a specific area of the website. So please have a look on it and to get the information you may need. And finally, I think it's one of my last slides. There are key actors. Of course, you have your CCMC PM if you have technical questions, but in your, let's say, operation business, you will need to contact several group of administrators. The first group is the data service. Those are the ones which are really dealing with the information. So every TC decision that you take by correspondence, by meetings, if you wish to have an action on the registration of a convener, things like that, this is data service that you need to contact. They are the one which will refresh all the information of the central database of CEN-CENELEC, which are then reflected into project tools. Production is obviously the department to whom you will send your draft standard for processing. The two last ones are more, let's say, less operational. If you have liaison with international organization, European association, you need to contact partners. And if you need to deal with research to support your standard, please contact a research department. That's all. I think we can dig in maybe the question now, if there